On February 19, 2025, during a live White House press briefing, a Reuters reporter asked Donald Trump whether he knew that a Canadian Crown investment vehicle had quietly secured mineral extraction rights covering 31% of Greenland's rare earth deposit corridor. The deal had been registered with the Greenlandic government 11 days earlier. Trump did not answer. He asked the reporter to repeat the question. That pause, 3 seconds of silence from a man who had spent 6 weeks publicly insisting Greenland should become American territory, told the world something no official statement ever could. Washington had been outmaneuvered quietly, without one military asset, on an island it had already described as essential to American national security. What happened during those 11 days is the part of the story almost nobody has fully explained. To understand how big Canada's move really was, you first have to understand what Greenland actually holds. The United States Geological Survey's 2023 Critical Minerals Assessment identified Greenland as having the largest untapped rare earth element deposit in the Western Hemisphere. Roughly 1.5 million metric tons of rare earth oxide equivalent, concentrated mainly in the Kvanefjeld complex in the south and the Citronen Fjord corridor in the north. Rare earth elements are not some obscure scientific curiosity. They are the building blocks of modern defense systems, electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, and semiconductor manufacturing. Without them, the F-35 fighter jet cannot be built. Without them, American battery factories cannot operate at scale. China controls about 60% of global rare earth production and around 85% of global rare earth processing capacity. The United States produces only a small share of what it consumes at home. And since 2020, Washington has been trying to build an alternative supply chain outside Chinese control. Greenland was supposed to be the answer to that problem. Trump had said that publicly again and again, going back to his first term. But Canada had read the same USGS report. Canada had also read the room. And in the 11 days between January 20th, 2025, Trump's inauguration, and the moment he first publicly floated military options for acquiring Greenland, and February 8th, when the mineral rights transaction was registered in Nuuk, someone in Ottawa moved faster than anyone in Washington thought possible. In the next 90 seconds, you'll see exactly who moved, how they moved, and what legal structure they used to make the deal almost impossible to reverse before Trump's team even realized it had happened. The Trump administration's Greenland strategy was not improvised. Inside its own logic, it was carefully considered. The first-term talk of buying Greenland back in 2019 had been treated around the world like a stunt. But inside the administration, it was not treated that way. It was seen as an early, clumsy announcement of a serious strategic goal. The minerals. The Arctic shipping routes opening because of accelerating ice melt. The defensive perimeter. Thule Air Base, now Patuxent Space Base, the northernmost American military installation on Earth, already sitting on Greenlandic soil under a 1951 basing agreement with Denmark. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, Greenland was on the strategic agenda from day one, not as a talking point, as an operational priority. The National Security Council had prepared a 34-page options document, later described in broad terms by 2 administration officials speaking to the Wall Street Journal. It laid out pathways ranging from a formal purchase offer to Denmark to expanded economic engagement with Greenland's autonomous government to unspecified pressure mechanisms meant to speed up Greenland's political movement toward independence and eventual American alignment. The core assumption in that document was simple. Time was on America's side. Greenland's rare earth deposits were not going anywhere. No other major power, they believed, had the legal position, financial strength, or political relationship with Nuuk to move on mineral rights before the United States could formalize its own plan. That assumption was wrong on every level, and the person who knew it was wrong was sitting in a building on O'Connor Street in Ottawa. The Canada Growth Fund, a federal crown corporation created in 2022 with an initial capitalization of 15 billion Canadian dollars, had a specific mandate to accelerate Canadian and allied investment in critical mineral supply chains. It had been monitoring Greenlandic mineral rights availability since early 2023. Its mandate clearly included international mineral rights acquisitions in places where Canadian economic and security interests aligned. Greenland qualified on both fronts. It sits within Canada's Arctic sphere of influence. It shares the Davis Strait maritime boundary, and since 2021, the Greenlandic government had been actively seeking foreign investment in its mineral sector as a way to fund greater political autonomy from Denmark. The Canada Growth Fund had already retained 2 Greenland-focused legal firms, one in Copenhagen and one in Nuuk. By September 2024, due diligence on the available license blocks in the Kvanefjeld corridor had been completed. By November 2024, the financing structure had been negotiated. A consortium involving the Canada Growth Fund, 2 Canadian pension funds, and a silent partner in the form of a Norwegian sovereign wealth vehicle. By December, the transaction was ready to close. It was deliberately held until January 20. Then it moved. But the administration's NSC team had missed one crucial detail. Under Greenlandic mineral law, specifically the Mineral Resources Act of 2009, which created the legal framework for Greenland's self-government authority over underground resources, mineral exploration and extraction licenses are issued by the Greenlandic government independently of Denmark. These are not Danish deals. They are Greenlandic sovereign transactions. No amount of American diplomatic pressure on Copenhagen, no matter how intense, could legally undo a properly registered Greenlandic mineral license once it had been issued. The entire structure of the deal was built around that legal reality. It was not designed to stay secret forever. It was designed to become irreversible before anyone found it. The transaction closed on February 8, 2025. It was registered with Greenland's Ministry of Mineral Resources and Justice in Nuuk at 9:14 a.m. local time. The acquiring entity appeared in the public registry as Borealis Critical Minerals LP, a limited partnership incorporated in Alberta on January 22, 2025, just 2 days after Trump's inauguration. Its general partner was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Canada Growth Fund. Its limited partners included the Alberta Investment Management Corporation, one of North America's largest pension fund managers, with $160 billion in assets under management, and a Luxembourg-registered vehicle that Canadian financial reporters would later connect to Norges Bank Investment Management, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the largest in the world, valued at roughly $1.7 trillion. The licenses covered exploration rights across 4 designated blocks in the southern Kvanefjeld corridor and 2 blocks in the Citronen Fjord zone. Using the USGS 2023 methodology, the combined assessed deposit value ranged from $47 billion to $89 billion in in-ground rare earth oxide equivalent, before extraction costs, before processing infrastructure, before market fluctuations. The transaction itself, including license fees and upfront rights payments, was worth 2.1 billion Canadian dollars, around $1.5 billion US at the exchange rate on the closing date. For $1.55 billion, Canada had secured a legal claim over a major portion of the most strategically important mineral deposit in the Western world. A deposit the United States had publicly described as essential to its national security. A deposit for which the United States had no competing legal claim, no registered exploration license, and no operational presence beyond the military base at Patuffik, which sits roughly 700 miles north of the Kvanefjeld complex and has nothing to do with mineral extraction. The transaction did not appear in Canadian or American media until February 19. That meant 11 days of silence while the paperwork was registered, the licenses were formally issued, the consortium's legal position was locked in, and the deal entered Greenland's public mineral rights database, searchable in Greenlandic and Danish by anyone who knew where to look. A Reuters journalist in Copenhagen knew where to look, and that was not even the worst part for Washington. The worst part was Norway. Norway is a NATO ally. It is also a co-holder of the Arctic Council's scientific research framework. and the involvement of Norges Bank Investment Management in the Borealis Consortium meant that the sovereign wealth fund of a NATO ally had just invested alongside Canada in mineral rights on territory the sitting American president had openly discussed acquiring by force if necessary. What do you do when your pressure campaign against an Arctic territory is answered by a NATO ally quietly placing $400 million into the very mineral rights you were trying to secure? Apparently, you pause. You ask the reporter to repeat the question, and then you call the Secretary of State. Secretary of State Marco Rubio placed calls to both his Canadian and Norwegian counterparts within 4 hours of the press briefing. State Department spokespeople described those calls as consultative, which in diplomatic language means we are trying to figure out what just happened. The first domino was diplomatic. The second was legal. The third was the one that reshaped America's critical mineral strategy for the next decade. Start in Nuuk. Greenland's Prime Minister, Kim Kielsen Egede, had been handling the Trump administration's Greenland pressure since January, with a mix of public defiance and private caution. Publicly, he had repeated that Greenland was not for sale. Privately, his government was balancing American interest, Danish alliance obligations, and the Greenlandic independence movement's push for faster economic self-sufficiency. The Borealis transaction changed Egede's negotiating position overnight. Greenland had now received 2.1 billion Canadian dollars in license revenue from a deal it had approved with a sovereign-backed consortium for mineral rights that Greenland had full authority to license under its own law. The money was already in Greenlandic government accounts. It was beyond the reach of any American diplomatic or legal tool. More importantly, the deal created a precedent. Greenland could conduct major mineral rights transactions with foreign entities, including entities closely tied to foreign governments, and those transactions would be valid, enforceable, and outside America's veto power. Egede's public statement on February 20th, one day after the Trump press briefing, ran 6 paragraphs. It thanked Canada and Norway for their confidence in Greenland's mineral future. It reaffirmed Greenland's right to manage its own underground resources under the Mineral Resources Act of 2009. And in the 5th paragraph, it stated that Greenland welcomed all responsible international investment in its critical mineral potential, as long as it followed Greenlandic law and the principles of free commerce. That 5th paragraph was not really aimed at investors. It was aimed at Washington. It was a public signal that the door was open to others and that American pressure had achieved the exact opposite of what it intended. By March 1st, the Australian government had formally reached out to Greenland's ministry about available license blocks in the Disco Island corridor. The United Kingdom's Critical Minerals Intelligence Center had sent a technical delegation to Nuuk. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry had issued a funding call for Japanese consortium participation in Greenlandic mineral rights acquisitions. The American pressure campaign had created a geopolitical gold rush. Every allied nation with a critical minerals strategy, which basically meant every serious industrial economy on Earth, now saw Greenland as an open market precisely because the United States had proven it could not close it. The legal side was just as damaging. By late February, the State Department's legal team had reviewed the Borealis transaction and concluded there was no realistic way to challenge the licenses under international law. Greenland had acted within its sovereign authority. Canada had acted within normal investment practice. Norway's participation fit within the mandate of its sovereign wealth fund. No WTO rule, no Arctic Council agreement, and no NATO treaty clause gave Washington grounds to challenge it. There was only one possible angle the NSC legal team thought might be usable: the 1951 defense agreement between the United States and Denmark, which gives America military access to Greenlandic territory. Their argument was that the agreement implied a security consultation requirement for major transactions involving Greenland's strategic resources. Denmark formally rejected that interpretation on March 3rd. The Danish Foreign Ministry released a 2-paragraph statement explaining that the 1951 agreement covered military basing rights and contained no provision governing Greenlandic civilian mineral licensing. Denmark also pointed out, very precisely, that Greenland's mineral resources had fallen under Greenlandic Autonomous Authority, not Danish authority, since the Self-Government Act of 2009. Washington had spent 2 months demanding that Denmark hand over Greenland. Denmark had spent those same 2 months pointing to the exact legal documents that now protected the Borealis transaction from American interference. The irony was built into the structure itself. Meanwhile, the rare earth processing issues surfaced in a way almost nobody had expected. The Kvanefjeld deposit contains more than rare earth elements. It also contains uranium, enough that previous efforts to develop the site had triggered Greenland's zero-tolerance uranium mining policy, a policy Greenland's parliament voted to suspend in 2021 before reinstating it after political backlash in 2023. The Borealis Consortium's license agreement included a very specific clause negotiated with the Greenlandic government. Uranium extraction was excluded from the licensed activities, and the consortium agreed to binding third-party environmental oversight for any rare earth processing work. That environmental and uranium exclusion was the detail that made the deal politically acceptable inside Greenland. And it was also the detail that made the deal permanently out of reach for any American commercial rival. Because American rare earth processing economics depend on being able to co-process uranium as a revenue offset. Canada and Norway had structured the agreement in a way that fit Greenlandic politics. American industry could not match it. The deal was not just legally irreversible, it was politically irreversible. By March 15, 2025, strategic studies departments from Washington to Beijing were still trying to process what had happened. China's response was the most revealing. On March 8th, the Global Times, the Chinese Communist Party's English-language foreign affairs outlet, published an editorial describing the Borealis transaction as proof of Western allied coordination in critical minerals strategy. And it was not wrong. China had spent 15 years assuming Western allies could not move fast enough or coordinate cleanly enough to build a competing rare earth supply chain. Then Canada, Norway, and Greenland did exactly that in 11 days, with no public announcement, for $1.55 billion US. The Pentagon's response was classified, but the broad outlines surfaced in a March 20 piece in Breaking Defense, where a defense industry analyst described what was happening behind the scenes. The Department of Defense had begun an internal review of its critical mineral dependency assumptions, especially around the timeline for rare earth supply development in the Western Hemisphere. That review had been built on the assumption that Greenlandic deposits would remain available for American commercial development. It could not assume that anymore. The line that captures this moment is simple. Canada did not buy Greenland. It bought the future America had promised itself and failed to secure. For $1.55 billion US, less than the cost of 2 F-35 fighter jets per rare earth dependent production run, Canada had gained legal control over a meaningful share of the mineral supply chain that American defense and technology industries need to function. Not control as in a monopoly, control as in a seat at the table, a seat Washington now has to negotiate around instead of dictating over. What remains unresolved is the processing question. Mineral rights are only the start of the supply chain, not the end. The ore still has to be mined, moved, processed into separated rare earth oxides, and then converted into the alloys and magnets that go into motors and missiles. Canada has secured the rights, but the processing infrastructure, the part of the chain where China still holds its deepest advantage, has yet to be built. As of March 2025, the Borealis Consortium had announced a feasibility study for a rare earth processing facility in Labrador. A feasibility study, not a groundbreaking, not a production timeline. The rights are secured. The real work is just beginning. But Greenland's mineral rights are not the end of this story. They are just the most visible chapter in a much larger restructuring now taking place across the Arctic. And that restructuring was dramatically accelerated by the pressure Washington applied and the response it never saw coming. The Arctic Council, the eight-nation body that oversees scientific and environmental cooperation in the Arctic region, includes Canada, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, Russia, and the United States. Russia has been suspended from active participation since 2022. The remaining 7 members have been quietly renegotiating the practical governance of Arctic resource access in Russia's absence, and the Greenland transaction has shifted the weight of that renegotiation toward the Canadian-Nordic axis in ways that may take years to fully understand. There is one specific document that matters here: the Ilulissat Declaration, signed in 2008 by the 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Russia, and the United States, committed its signatories to resolving Arctic territorial and resource disputes through existing international law instead of creating new legal frameworks. The United States signed that declaration, and now it is the country whose president publicly discussed military acquisition of Arctic territory, while its allies quietly used existing international law to secure the resource positions he failed to lock down. The Ilulissat Declaration is not a restraint on Canada. It is a restraint on Washington, and Ottawa knows it. The next major decision point comes in the fall of 2025, when Greenland's parliament, the Inatsisartut, is scheduled to vote on a new minerals framework that will govern licensing for the remaining undeveloped blocks in the northern Citronen Fjord zone. Those blocks are believed to contain roughly 40% of Greenland's total rare earth deposit volume. They are not yet licensed, they are not yet allocated. Every country with a critical minerals strategy is already in Nuuk. Some have been there for months. Washington has an application on file. It was submitted by a U.S. commercial consortium, not a government vehicle, not a crown corporation, in mid-February, 11 days after the Borealis deal closed, in what internal State Department communications later described as an emergency commercial engagement. That application is still pending. Under Greenlandic law, its legal standing is the same as every other applicant's. Canada has a seat at the table it built for $1.55 billion. America is filling out paperwork. Because what the Inatsisartut decides in the fall of 2025 about those northern blocks, about who gets a place at the table, about whether the country that spent 6 weeks threatening to annex their island gets to participate in its mineral future, will decide everything.